The sky was quiet that morning. The kind of quiet that doesn't promise peace. Just waiting, watching. The kind that presses down on the chest and makes your breath feel borrowed. Ada stood where no woman should have had to stand, tied to the center post of Dry Creek Square. Her dress, once white, clung to her back where the blood had started to dry, the fabric torn and speckled with dirt. The wind blew soft, like it didn't want to disturb what was already broken. They said it was because she'd lain with a Lakota. That was the word the pastor spat from the church steps. His Bible gripped tight like it might shield him from what he was doing. Unnatural, he called her, a betrayal of God's order. But Ada knew what this was. It wasn't about purity, it wasn't about religion, it wasn't even about her. It was about defiance. She had stood too tall, spoke too direct, stayed unmarried too long, and when the town couldn't put her in a dress with a ring, it tied her to a post with rope. No one looked at her face. Not really. They looked at her hands bound behind her. They looked at her shoulder blades where the whip would land. They looked at her feet, bare against the hot wood planks. But not her eyes, because to look in her eyes would mean admitting she was still human. The sheriff read the charges like he was reading out a grocery list. No tremble in his voice. No shame in his stance. He'd been to her father's home more than once. Shared stew at their table. Called her mother ma'am with respect. That didn't matter now. His boots scraped against the dust as he stepped back. Ada didn't cry. She held her chin high, jaw tight like stone. She wouldn't give them what they wanted. Not the sound, not the tears, but the pain. Oh, the pain didn't care about pride. When the first lash struck, it ripped more than skin. It split memory. It pulled forward every moment she had thought she was safe in this town. Every polite smile, every good morning, Miss Mayfield, every time she believed she belonged. She bled in front of the same women who once brought her thread and patterns to sew Sunday dresses. The same men who nodded at her when she carried her father's letters to the post office. But now their eyes were stones. Their mouths tight. No one reached for her. No one turned away. And behind it all, standing in the shadow of the old church, was Jeremiah. He didn't look proud. He didn't look angry either. Just vacant. Like all of this had nothing to do with him. Like he hadn't whispered vows in her ear just weeks ago. Like he hadn't knelt beside her sick sister and watched her feed her spoonfuls of bark tea, the very tea given to her by a man across the ridge. The Lakota man. She hadn't even known his name. He'd given her medicine. That was all. She had brought berries, an offering, a quiet trade, not for favor, not for romance, for help, and he had given it without condition. But someone saw her return with her hair down, smiling in the kind of way that townsfolk don't like a woman to smile without reason. And Jeremiah, he saw too. Ada had thought he would ask. She had hoped he'd trust her. But instead, he ran to the sheriff. Said she'd crossed the line. Said she'd brought shame to her family. Said she offered herself to the savage and came back with wildness in her heart. And just like that, her name was no longer hers. She wasn't Ada the seamstress. She wasn't Ada the eldest daughter of the Mayfields. She wasn't the woman said to marry the man with fine boots and his father's land papers. She was Ada the whore. Ada the savage's girl. Ada the disgrace. The second lash came. And the third, each one louder than the last. Not in sound, but in silence. No one spoke. No one moved. The whole town breathing together like they were waiting for something to break. And maybe it did. Maybe it was her skin. Maybe it was the rope. Maybe it was the last part of her heart that had believed someone, anyone, would say enough. But no one did. Not until he came. He didn't ride in like thunder. Didn't carry a rifle or shout. He just stood, at the edge of the square. Braids down his chest, eyes steady, shoulders like they could carry mountains. The Lakota man looked at her, not at the blood, not the rope, at her. That's when the sheriff hesitated. Just for a moment, just long enough to hear the crack in his own voice as he cleared his throat. The fourth lash never landed. The crowd shifted, uncertain, but Ada didn't look away. Couldn't. Her eyes locked on the man who had no reason to stand for her, but did. He hadn't claimed her, hadn't called her his, and that's why it mattered. He came because she didn't deserve to be alone. And in that moment, with her back torn, hands raw, and dignity stripped bare, Ada realized something deeper than pain. She hadn't been destroyed by the whip. She had been destroyed by trust. Jeremiah had sold her name for a deed, traded her body for a boundary line, made her a tool in a game he was too coward to finish. Ada closed her eyes and let the shame wash over her, not because she deserved it, but because it had nowhere else to go. She bore it like generations of women had borne it before her. Quietly, without rescue, without reason. But when the ropes were cut, and her legs barely held her, it wasn't a townsperson who stepped forward. It wasn't the sheriff who caught her fall. It wasn't the man who once vowed to build a life with her. It was the stranger. And with one outstretched hand, scarred, silent, steady, he gave her the only thing no one else dared, a choice. The fourth lash never came. There was no voice that stopped it, no protest, no crack of thunder from above, just a breath, a pause, and a presence. He stood at the edge of the square. One man, a stranger to most, a shadow to some, a Lakota with long dark braids and skin the color of river stone. Wrapped in silence like it was armor. He didn't speak, he didn't shout, he didn't so much as twitch. And yet, the sheriff's hand froze mid-air, the leather whip trembling between his fingers as though it had lost its purpose. Ada felt it before she saw him. The shift in the wind. The stillness that wasn't fear, but respect wrapped in stillness. The kind of quiet that made even the birds hush. She turned her head, just slightly, enough to see him, enough to know. He hadn't come with fire. He hadn't come to tear down the post or drag her away. He didn't come to make war. He came to stand. And somehow, that was enough. The sheriff swallowed, loud in the hush. His boots shuffled back one step, then another. No one said anything. No one dared. Even the pastor, still clutching his Bible with white-knuckled devotion, looked away. Ada didn't understand it at first. How could a single man make a whole town forget how to breathe? But then she saw his eyes, anchored on her face. Not her wounds, not her torn dress or the blood trailing down her back. He saw her, and that was more unsettling to them than any threat could have been. In Dry Creek, men shouted to show power. They drank, they barked orders, they wore guns and rode horses like extensions of their pride. But this man, this Wicasa, he did none of those things. He simply stood like the earth had grown tired of moving and chose, just for a moment, to become him. No one told the sheriff to step down. No one gave the order to untie her. But slowly, like fog lifting, things began to change. The whip was lowered. The rope was cut. Ada's arms fell to her sides, numb and trembling. And still, Wicasa didn't move. She staggered. Her knees buckled. The town just watched. Men with badges, women with Bibles, neighbors, friends, people who had once laughed with her, stitched with her, eaten bread at her table. They all stood and stared like she was something strange, something other. She nearly collapsed. That's when Wicasa moved, 3 strides, silent, measured. The earth barely noticed. He didn't touch her. He didn't reach. He simply came close enough to be present. And in that presence, the square parted like water splitting around stone. Ada leaned against the post, breath shaky. The heat of her back screamed. But the cold of being alone had already done more damage. Then, he extended his hand. Not a demand, not a rescue, not a claim. Just a hand, open, waiting. Jeremiah, her former fiancé, stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. His voice was brittle with indignation. "She's not yours," he barked. "Go back to where you belong." But even he didn't step closer. Not with those eyes locked on him. Not with that unshakable calm staring back. Not with that silence that made a man question the worth of his own voice. Wicasa didn't reply, didn't even blink. And Ada? Ada looked at the hand again. It was broad, scarred, the hand of someone who had built things and broken things and still knew gentleness. She reached. The moment her fingers touched his, sound returned, shoes shifting, whispers catching, lungs gasping like the whole town had been underwater and didn't know until breath hit them. He helped her down, step by step, not rushed, not heroic, just steady. When her knees faltered, his arm slid behind her back, not to carry, just to support. And together, they walked, not toward the jail, not toward the church, toward the road. Behind them, a murmur rose, confusion, Disbelief. Some gasped. Others hissed. A child whispered, "Is he taking her?" A mother snapped, "She ain't worth it." But he didn't look back. And neither did Ada. With each step, the weight of the town lessened. The judgment, the betrayal, the pain of standing alone. All of it slipped behind her like a shadow outpaced by the sun. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to, because it wasn't about destination. It was about departure. She left not just the square. She left the version of herself they'd tried to bury beneath guilt and shame. She left behind the girl who was always too loud, too proud, too much. She left the name they soiled, the dress they tore, the altar they never let her reach. She left it all. And Wicasa? He never claimed her, never said mine, never tried to fix what was broken. He simply walked beside her, as if saying, "You are not ruined. You are just walking." By the time they reached the tree line, the last of the town's voices had faded. Only wind and dust remained. Ada turned once, just to see. The post was still there, crooked and splintered, stained with her blood, but now, it looked smaller, insignificant. The town hadn't changed, but she had, and it all started with a man who didn't fight, didn't speak, didn't save. He just stood, and somehow, that was enough to free her. The forest didn't welcome her. Not at first. It didn't soften its ground or hush its winds. It offered no shelter, no forgiveness. It was not a haven, it was an uncarved place, asking only one thing: adapt, or be swallowed. Ada had never split wood, never lit a fire from scratch. Her fingers, once skilled at stitching fine seams, trembled as they fumbled with flint. Her back still burned, her pride even more raw. But in the wild, pain wasn't ornamental, it wasn't judged, it simply was. And so she learned, not from lectures. Wicasa didn't explain much, he didn't draw maps or give long instructions. He moved, and she watched. He knelt, and she mirrored. When he crushed herbs between two stones, she copied the rhythm until her own hands remembered how to heal. He showed her how to line pine needles under skin for warmth, how to set traps with bone and bark, how to feel a trail not with eyes, but through the shift of birdsong or the leaning of grass. Each task he passed on without comment, like passing a flame, never pushing, never withholding. In that silence, she grew. Ada began to wake before the light fully reached the ground. She learned which roots to boil and which to bury. Her feet toughened, her shoulders broadened. The softness they once tried to beat out of her didn't vanish, it simply changed shape. It became callous, it became instinct, but it was not survival alone that shaped her. It was what they survived together. The fire came on the fourth evening. Not their fire, but one far to the east, where smoke curled like a black snake across the treetops. Wicasa saw it first. He didn't speak, just stood, eyes narrowing, wind pressing against his cheek like it was asking for guidance. Then came the cry, not loud, not near, but real, a child's panic swallowed by distance. They ran. Branches tore at her arms. Roots threatened her balance. But Ada didn't slow. Her body had stopped asking if it could, and simply did. When they reached the clearing, the scene clawed at her throat. A way station, old, half forgotten, was burning. Flames licked at the roof. Smoke poured from the windows. And outside, a little girl stood frozen, holding something small and scorched, perhaps a doll, perhaps a memory. Her dress was streaked with ash, her face blank with shock. "My brother's inside," she whispered. Ada didn't hesitate. Her legs moved before her thoughts caught up. The fire screamed, but so did silence, the kind she knew too well, of no one coming, of no one caring. She wrapped a soaked hide around her face, Wicasa's doing, quick and practiced. Then he vanished into the fire, wrapped in smoke and purpose. Ada dropped beside the girl, shielding her from the heat. "We're not leaving him," she said, voice raw but certain. The girl gripped her hand like it was the last solid thing on earth. And then Wicasa returned, boy in his arms, coughing but alive. That night, the children didn't ask questions. Neither did Ada. Some things don't need names to be understood. The girl, Hattie, curled beside Ada without a word. The boy, Caleb, coughed through the dark until Ada wrapped him in Wicasa's blanket, whispering old stories she barely remembered from her mother's lips. The next morning, They didn't leave, and Wicasa didn't tell them to. The days passed, shaped by routine, not rules. Caleb learned to carry water. Copying Wicasa's quiet gait, Hattie plucked herbs, watching Ada's hands, mimicking their care. The cabin, if it could be called that, grew one log at a time. No blueprints, just instinct, just need. Ada sewed again. Not lace, not wedding gowns, but satchels, slings, blankets for aching backs. She stitched not for ceremony, but for shelter. And somehow, the work meant more. Some nights, Wicasa carved in the firelight. He never told her what the wooden figures were, but she began to find them placed quietly beside her tools or at the base of her bedroll. A woman standing tall. A girl holding a flame. A bird in flight. When she asked him why he carved them, he only said, "So you remember who you are." She did, not all at once, but slowly. Ada began to look at herself without flinching, without apology. The scars on her back no longer dictated her story, they were just part of it. The forest did not name her. Neither did Wicasa, and that was the gift. Because in this place, she named herself. She wasn't wife, wasn't property, wasn't Mayfield or scandal or shame. She wasn't waiting to be claimed. She simply was Ada, and that was enough. It didn't feel like a family, not at first. There were no ceremonies, no surnames, no declarations, just breath shared under one roof. Just tasks divided not by role, but by rhythm. One night, Caleb asked her, "Are you our mother now?" Ada looked at Wicasa. He didn't answer, just placed another log on the fire. She turned back to the boy. "No," she said, "but I'll fight for you like one." That seemed to be enough. And maybe that's what made them a family, not blood, not law, but the choice to protect, to stay, to build something chosen instead of inherited. Ada had once sewn dresses for other people's dreams. Now she was living one that belonged only to her. Not because it was easy, but because it was real. The town hadn't changed. Dry Creek still sat low against the horizon. Its buildings weathered by dust. Its church bell cracked and rusting in its frame. The same wooden saloon doors creaked with laughter that didn't reach the street. Same faces, same shadows behind windows. But Ada had changed. She didn't ride in fast or loud. No crowd gathered to greet her. She came in quiet, wrapped in the red and cream blanket Wicasa had given her. Shoulders straight, steps deliberate. The children, Hattie and Caleb, waited at the tree line with Wicasa. They didn't need to follow. This was her walk. The townsfolk noticed her the way deer notice a hunter, not with fear, but with that deep stillness born of discomfort. A few women paused mid-broomstroke on porches. A man lowered his whiskey glass in the saloon window. A child whispered, tugging at her mother's skirt, "Is that her?" They knew. She didn't hide. She didn't need to. Each step echoed on the plank road like it had purpose. She wasn't here to ask. Not for forgiveness. Not for explanation. She came to face the post. It stood crooked now, splintered from years of sun and silence. The base still stained with blood, hers. Maybe others, but it wasn't holy. It wasn't feared. It had simply become another forgotten piece of timber. A relic of cruelty they no longer spoke of. Ada walked right up to it. No one stopped her. She reached into the satchel across her shoulder and pulled out a cloth. It wasn't random. She had painted it herself the night before. Symbols passed down from Wicasa's people and symbols she had created. Fire. Water. 2 children. A tree whose roots formed a heart. It wasn't just art. It was language. A message no sermon could touch. Her fingers tied it with steady grace, knotting the strip tight around the same post they once bound her to. Then, she stepped back, eyes scanning the square, not searching, not challenging, just looking. A few people tried to pretend they didn't see her, but their stillness betrayed them. Ada's voice was clear, low, firm. She didn't need to shout. "This is no longer yours." She didn't say the post. She didn't say the shame. She didn't say me. But they all understood. "It's mine now." With that, she turned. No applause followed. No protest either. Just the crunch of boots on dry earth. The world didn't cheer her for surviving what they had done. It simply watched her walk away and tried to convince itself it didn't feel smaller in her shadow. At the edge of town, Wicasa waited, calm as ever, not guarding, not hovering, just there, Hattie and Caleb sat on the back of the horse, 2 baskets of seeds in their laps, legs swinging like the world had always been this simple. They said nothing, just watched her approach. Wicasa tilted his head once, a silent question in his eyes. Did they speak? He asked. Ada mounted the horse without answering at first. She looked once over her shoulder, at the church that had condemned her. At the sheriff's office where the deal for her father's land was inked in betrayal. At the people who now shrank behind curtains and doorways. They remembered, she said, and that's enough. Then they rode, not fast, not fleeing, just forward, toward the forest where the cottonwoods grew thick, toward the soil they'd turned with bare hands, toward the clearing that no law claimed, toward the fire they'd built with children who chose them, not because they had to, but because they believed. And as the sun dropped behind the ridge, the town faded behind her. She didn't feel lighter, she felt anchored, grounded by something deeper than revenge. This wasn't victory, it wasn't forgiveness, it was claiming what no longer had the power to own her. That post, they had used it to break her. Now, it stood as a marker for something they couldn't erase. Her will, her truth, her name. They said a woman doesn't come back from something like that. That once shamed. She belongs to the silence, to the margins, to the memory of what she used to be. But Ada didn't return to reclaim what they took. She returned to bury it, properly. With her own hands, under her own sky, by her own rules. They could keep their guilt, their sideways glances, their silence. She had something better, the freedom of no longer belonging. They didn't ask permission to stay. There was no deed to sign, no preacher to bless it, no man to raise a flag and call it theirs. The land didn't require it. The trees didn't care. The wind only asked that they treat it with respect. And so they did, in a clearing where the deer drank from a shallow stream and the cottonwoods whispered through the heat. They laid their lives down gently, like seeds into good soil. Ada had never felt so light. Not because the work was easy. It wasn't. The days were hard, long, and filled with sweat and silence. But every stone she carried, every log she helped Wicasa roll into place, was for her, for them, for a home not built on obligation, but on choice. She was no longer someone's daughter, no longer someone's almost wife. She was not the shame they painted on her back or the scandal they muttered through clenched teeth. She was just Ada, and that was enough. The cabin rose slowly, like a promise kept, walls made of timber and determination, a roof patched with bark and hide, later with thatch and tar they traded for down the ridge. Caleb carved shelves into the logs, small and uneven at first, but proud. Hattie gathered flowers and stones and lined the entrance like it was a place meant for beauty. It was. There was no gate, no fence, no sign that said this is ours. But everything about it was claimed, not through conquest, but through presence. Every handprint in the mud, every footprint in the ash, every night spent watching the fire flicker low while stars blinked overhead, they were writing something no law could name. Ada found freedom not in the absence of rules, but in the making of her own. She rose with the sun and tended the fire. She taught Hattie to stitch, not for vanity, but for strength, to mend, to shape. She watched as Wicasa and Caleb tracked deer, not to kill recklessly, but to learn, to listen to the land, not take from it blindly. They didn't speak of what had been left behind. The church, the post, the names, not because they forgot, but because they didn't need to relive it. That pain had served its purpose. It had burned down the house that once held them prisoner. This was their new ground. Some nights, the children would ask stories. "Were you ever married?" Caleb asked once. Ada smiled, brushing ash from her fingers. "I almost was, but not to the right person." "What happened?" I said no without saying it out loud. And then I learned how to say it with my whole life. Hattie looked at her for a long time, then whispered, "Are we yours now?" Ada looked at Wicasa. He sat quiet, whittling a bird from a piece of cedar. He didn't answer. He never rushed these moments. Ada looked back at the girl. "I chose you," she said softly, "and you chose me. That's stronger than blood." Wicasa never gave her vows. He didn't promise her forever. He didn't press his name onto hers or build her a fence and call it love. Instead, he placed things. A carved figure of a woman with open arms. A smooth stone with a line down the middle. shaped like a river, a small bowl for herbs beside the fire. He didn't say what they meant, but he placed them where she would find them. Ada didn't ask, because she understood. They lived not by seasons, but by moments. When the rains came early and flooded the south ridge, they learned to build higher. When frost came late and bit their fingers raw, they learned to trap smarter. When the children laughed, louder and freer each month, they marked their growth not by height, but by joy. There was no law to define them, but they were a family. Not because someone wrote it down, but because they lived like one. One morning, as the sun filtered through the trees, Ada stood at the edge of the clearing. She held a handful of wildflower seeds Caleb had gathered. The earth was soft from the last night's rain. Her hands, scarred but steady, pressed the seeds into the soil, not to tame the land, but to belong to it. Wicasa stepped beside her, hands full of stones for the garden's edge. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of hiding, or fear, or pain. It was the silence of knowing, of presence, of peace. Ada watched the children chase a rabbit near the stream, bare feet kicking up mud, laughter rising like birds startled into flight. She felt something bloom in her chest, not pride, not even relief, something simpler, belonging. This was not the life she was given. It was the one she built, with hands that once trembled, with a back that once bled, with a name they tried to take but she reclaimed one syllable at a time. Just Ada. Not a bride, not a burden, not a transaction, a woman, a choice, a root. And the world, this time, didn't argue. It listened.